My name is Ryan Miller. I'm 41 years old, and this happened last October in Blackwater River State Forest, Florida. After my wife, Karen, passed away 6 months earlier, I found myself drifting. The house was too quiet, my mind too loud, and I thought maybe some time alone in nature would help me heal, or at least help me breathe again. Karen and I loved camping, especially at Blackwater Creek. It was one of the first places we visited together. So I loaded up my RV, packed my dog Daisy, and headed out, thinking I'd find some solace in the woods. I didn't know I'd be running for my life by the end of the trip. I arrived at the forest mid-afternoon, the October sunlight warm and golden through the pine trees. Blackwater Creek ran dark and slow, its tannin-stained water reflecting the sky like a mirror. The place hadn't changed much since Karen and I were here last, though the silence felt heavier this time. Or maybe that was just me. As I set up camp, Daisy sniffed around, her tail wagging with excitement. She was a sweet Labrador retriever, my constant companion since Karen passed. If it weren't for Daisy, I probably wouldn't have left the house at all. Just as I finished settling in, an older man approached. He looked like he belonged in the woods, with his weathered face, flannel shirt, and a hunter's cap pulled low over his brow. "Name's Henry Watson," he said, extending a hand. "You camping here alone?" "Just me and Daisy," I replied, shaking his hand. "Why?" Henry glanced toward the creek. "This area's got some history. Folks around here call it cursed. Kids used to drown in that creek back in the old days. They say their spirits still wander, looking for someone to play with." I chuckled nervously. "Ghost stories, huh?" He didn't laugh. "You hear a child calling out, you leave it alone, you hear me? Don't go looking. Ain't nothing good in those woods after dark." I thanked him for the warning. Though I didn't take it seriously, I wasn't here for ghost stories. I was here to clear my head. That first night, the forest was eerily still. I sat by the fire sipping a beer, while Daisy lay at my feet. The sound of the crackling flames was the only thing breaking the silence. Around midnight, I woke to Daisy growling. Her ears were pricked, her body tense as she stared at the RV's door. I listened, my heart pounding. At first, I heard nothing. But then came the unmistakable sound of laughter, light and childlike, drifting through the night. I froze. It couldn't be a child. Not out here. The laughter came again, closer this time, followed by soft footsteps circling the RV. Daisy barked, a deep, guttural sound that I'd never heard from her before. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, shining the beam into the darkness. "Hello? Is someone out there?" Silence. The forest swallowed my words, and for a moment I thought I saw movement by the creek. A small figure darting behind a tree, but when I blinked, it was gone. I closed the door, locking it this time, and stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I told myself the laughter had been the wind, the footsteps an animal. But Daisy wasn't acting like herself. She stayed close to me, growling at nothing and refusing to leave the RV. Determined not to let my nerves ruin the trip, I took a hike along the creek. The trail was muddy from recent rain, and the water had risen higher than usual. About a mile in, I noticed something strange. Small handprints pressed into the mud along the bank. They were too small to belong to an adult, and the thought of a child wandering out here alone sent a chill down my spine. Further along, I found an old doll tangled in the roots of a cypress tree. Its dress was torn, and its painted face had faded with time, but it was unmistakably a child's toy. I picked it up, and an icy shiver ran through me, as if the air around me had turned cold. That's when I heard the voice. "Help me." It was faint, coming from the woods to my left. a little girl's voice, trembling with fear. My heart raced. I knew what Henry had said, but what if someone really needed help? "Hello? Where are you?" "Help me." The voice was closer now, leading me off the trail. I followed it, calling out, but I found nothing. No child, no footprints, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. I turned back toward the RV, and that's when I saw her. A girl, no older than 7, stood by the creek. She was pale, her dark hair dripping with water, and she wore a tattered white dress. She didn't speak, just stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. She pointed to the creek, her lips trembling. "They're in the water." Before I could respond, she vanished, as if she'd never been there. I couldn't stop thinking about the girl. Who was she? Why had she disappeared? The questions gnawed at me as I sat in the RV that night, Daisy pressed against my leg. I considered leaving, but a part of me felt compelled to stay, as though the forest itself wouldn't let me go. The whispers started just after midnight. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, filling the air with the childlike giggles and cries for help. Daisy barked and growled, her fur standing on end. Then I saw them. Handprints, small and wet, appearing on the RV windows. The whispers turned into a chorus, overlapping voices calling my name. "Ryan! Ryan! Come play with us!" Terrified, I grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door. The forest was alive with movement, shadows flitting between the trees, glowing eyes peering out from the darkness. And there, by the creek, was the girl again. She smiled this time, her teeth too sharp, her eyes too black. "Stay with us," she whispered. I slammed the door shut, barricading it with whatever I could find. Daisy whined, pacing nervously as the RV shook, the voices growing louder. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing in, suffocating me. At dawn, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed up as quickly as I could, throwing everything into the RV. Daisy barked furiously as I started the engine, her eyes fixed on the tree line. As I drove away, the whispers followed. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them. Children, dozens of them, standing by the creek. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty, and their mouths stretched into unnatural grins. At the center of them stood the girl, holding the doll I'd found. She waved at me, a mockery of innocence. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Back home, I tried to put the experience behind me, but the memories lingered. A week later, I found the doll in the back of the RV. I knew I hadn't brought it with me. I burned it that night, watching the flames consume its tattered dress and faded face. But even as it turned to ash, I could still hear the whispers. "Ryan, come play with us." My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 38 years old and I work as a children's book illustrator. This happened just last fall when I decided to take my RV to Ocala National Forest in Florida. I wasn't looking for trouble, only a bit of peace and quiet. A break from the relentless deadlines and hopefully some inspiration for my next book. I thought the stillness of the forest would calm my racing thoughts. Instead, it left me with nightmares I can't escape. It was early October, and the forest was alive with color. The cypress trees, draped in Spanish moss, towered around me as I navigated my RV down a narrow dirt road. My dog, Max, sat in the passenger seat, his ears pricked with curiosity. He was always my loyal shadow, and I was glad for his company. I parked near Juniper Springs, a spot I'd chosen for its seclusion and beauty. The spring shimmered in the afternoon sunlight, crystal clear and eerily still. I set up camp, unpacking my sketch pad and a few supplies. Sheriff Benson, a gruff local who I'd met at the trailhead, had warned me to stick to the marked trails, and not to wander after dark. He mentioned something about the devil's lantern, but I waved him off. Every place had its ghost stories. I wasn't here for folklore, I was here to work. The first night was uneventful, though the silence felt heavy. The usual hum of crickets and frogs seemed muted. Max growled a few times at nothing in particular, but I figured he was just adjusting to the new surroundings. I spent the next day sketching the landscape, trying to capture the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. Max explored the area, occasionally coming back to nudge me for attention. I was starting to feel relaxed, even inspired, until night fell. It started with the light. At first, I thought it was a firefly, glowing faintly through the trees, but the glow grew brighter, flickering like a lantern. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the RV. Max followed, his hackles raised. The light hovered just beyond the edge of the campsite, swaying slightly as if someone were carrying it. "Hello?" I called out, shining my flashlight toward it. No response. The light retreated, bobbing deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I took a few steps closer. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" Max barked sharply, snapping me out of my daze. I realized my feet were inches from the trail's edge, and the lantern was much farther away than I'd thought. It wasn't waiting for me, it was leading me. I backed away, pulling Max inside the RV and locking the door. The light flickered one last time before vanishing. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe a prank by some local kids. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it left behind. I spent the morning sketching, but my hand felt unsteady. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see the lantern again. When I finally looked down at my sketch pad, I froze. I hadn't been drawing the spring or the trees. I'd been drawing her. A woman, faint and glowing, stood at the edge of my page. Her face was obscured, but her outline was unmistakable. I hadn't drawn her intentionally. My hand had moved on its own. Max growled low in his throat, pulling me from my thoughts. He was staring at the door, his ears flattened. "It's okay, boy," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. That night, the whispers started. I woke to the sound of footsteps circling the RV. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. Max barked and scratched at the door, his teeth bared. Then I heard the laughter. It was faint, like a child giggling, but it sent a chill down my spine. I peered out the window but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and the laughter faded. I sat in the dark, clutching Max, until the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. The next morning, I decided to explore the trails, hoping to clear my head. Sheriff Benson's warning echoed in my mind, but I dismissed it. I couldn't let a few strange noises ruin my trip. I followed the marked trail for about a mile before I saw the carvings. Symbols, circles, crosses and spirals, etched into the bark of several trees. They looked old, weathered by time, but they didn't feel random. I sketched them into my notebook, intending to research them later. As I turned back toward the RV, I saw it again. The lantern. This time, it wasn't distant. It hovered just a few yards away, glowing faintly in the dim light of the forest. My heart pounded as I stared at it, unable to move. Then it began to drift, pulling me deeper into the woods. "Evelyn." The voice was soft, almost melodic, and it seemed to come from the light itself. Max barked furiously, breaking the spell. I turned and ran, dragging him behind me. When I reached the RV, I slammed the door shut and didn't leave for the rest of the day. By the time night fell, I was ready to leave. I'd packed most of my things and planned to drive out first thing in the morning. But the forest had other plans. The lantern appeared again, closer than ever, just outside the RV. Its glow seeped through the windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Max barked and growled, his body pressed against my legs. Then I heard the knock. It was soft, polite, almost human. But when I looked out the window, no one was there, just the lantern, swaying gently. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it echoed through the RV. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, clutching a flashlight like a weapon. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then the door creaked open. The lantern floated inside, its glow illuminating the cramped space. Behind it, the figure of a woman took shape. Her face was pale, her eyes empty voids, and her hair floated around her as if underwater. She reached out a hand, her voice echoing in my mind. "Stay with me!" I screamed and threw the flashlight, shattering the lantern's glow. The figure dissolved into mist, and the RV was plunged into darkness. Max whimpered, and I held him tightly, tears streaming down my face. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I started the RV and drove away without looking back. Max sat in the passenger seat, silent and watchful. My hands trembled on the wheel, but I didn't stop until I was miles from the forest. A week later, I found the sketches I'd made during the trip. The glowing woman was in every one of them, standing among the trees, watching me. I burned them all. I haven't been back to the woods since. Sometimes, though, I see a faint light in the distance when I close my eyes. And sometimes I hear her voice. Evelyn. My name is Jack Harrington, and this happened in November of last year at Lake Diston in Flagler County, Florida. I thought I knew the wilderness. I thought I was prepared for anything nature could throw at me. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. I'd convinced my girlfriend, Megan, 30, and my best friend, Sam, 29, to join me on this trip. We were going to camp by the lake, explore its hidden beauty, and document everything for my hiking blog, Into the Wild. Sam would handle the filming with his fancy drone. Megan would bring her sharp wit to our banter, and I'd lead the way. I'd heard whispers about the lake's haunting reputation. Locals claimed it was cursed or haunted, but I shrugged it off. Every place has its ghost stories, right? The first day was uneventful. We set up camp near the shore, close enough to launch our kayaks, but far enough from the water line to avoid gators. The towering cypress trees, draped in Spanish moss, cast long shadows over the still water, their reflections rippling like an oil painting. The place was eerily quiet. No cars, no planes overhead, just the occasional croak of a bullfrog or the splash of something unseen in the water. My tent had a tear along the seam, and I cursed myself for not checking it before we left. Megan teased me mercilessly while patching it with duct tape. Sam was already flying his drone, narrating his shots like a nature documentary host. Everything seemed fine, until the sun dipped below the horizon. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't an animal call, and it wasn't the wind. It was a whisper, faint, just beyond the edge of our camp. It sounded like someone saying my name. "Jack?" I sat up, heart pounding, and scanned the darkness. The campfire had died down to embers, and the shadows of the trees stretched unnaturally long, almost reaching the tents. I told myself it was just my imagination and lay back down, but the whisper came again. "Jack?" This time it was closer, almost in my ear. I shot up and unzipped my tent, stepping out into the cold night air. Megan stirred and mumbled something, but Sam snored on obliviously. I scanned the camp with my flashlight but saw nothing unusual, just trees and shadows. The whisper didn't come back, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I chalked the whisper up to a dream, though Megan noticed the dark circles under my eyes. Bad night? She asked, smirking as she sipped her coffee. I shrugged it off. Sam was buzzing with excitement. You won't believe what I saw on the drone footage, he said, pulling out his laptop. We gathered around as he played the video. Most of it was scenic shots of the lake and forest, but at one point the drone had hovered near the waterline and caught something odd. A figure, blurry and humanoid, crouched among the cypress roots. It was too far away to make out details, but the proportions were wrong. Its arms seemed too long, its head too small. Probably a trick of the light, I said, though the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Megan wasn't convinced. That's not a trick of the light, Jack. That's a person, or something pretending to be one. The whispers came back that night, but this time I wasn't the only one who heard them. Megan shook me awake around 2 a.m., her face pale in the dim glow of her flashlight. Did you hear that? She whispered. I nodded, straining to listen. The whispers were faint but unmistakable, circling the camp. They didn't sound like one voice, but several, overlapping and disjointed. Sam stumbled out of his tent, rubbing his eyes. What the hell is going on? He asked groggily. Before I could answer, Megan pointed to the edge of the camp. A raccoon stood there staring at us. Its eyes glinted in the light, but it didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, unnaturally still. Then it turned and walked away, on 2 legs. By now, we were all on edge. The tension between Megan and me was palpable, and Sam was growing increasingly jittery. His drone had stopped working entirely, its feed glitching out every time he tried to fly it. It's like something's jamming the signal, he muttered, fiddling with the controls. We decided to hike deeper into the woods, hoping to clear our heads. As we walked, we found strange markings carved into the trees, symbols I didn't recognize. Megan took pictures with her phone, muttering about sending them to a folklorist friend. The trail led us to a clearing, where we spotted something that made my blood run cold. It was the figure from Sam's drone footage, crouched by the water. Only now, it wasn't blurry, it was real. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over sharp bones, its eyes black and soulless. It moved like a puppet on broken strings, jerky and unnatural. When it turned its head to look at us, I felt a wave of nausea so strong I thought I'd be sick. We bolted back to camp. That night, the whispers didn't circle the camp, they came inside it. They called our names, mimicking our voices. Megan's voice called from the woods, though she was right next to me. Sam's voice laughed from the darkness, though he was cowering in his tent. When I stepped out to confront whatever was out there, I saw it standing at the edge of the firelight. The shape, the thing. It wasn't just one figure now. It was 2, then 3, then more, all shifting and blending together like smoke. They whispered, laughed, and reached for us with 2 long arms. "Back off," I shouted, grabbing a burning stick from the fire and swinging it wildly. The figures recoiled but didn't disappear. Instead, they melted back into the shadows, leaving behind an oppressive silence. By dawn, we'd had enough. We packed up in record time and loaded the kayaks. Sam was pale and silent, clutching his camera like a lifeline. Megan refused to look at me, her face set in grim determination. As we paddled away from the campsite, I felt a strange sense of relief, until I noticed something floating in the water. It was Sam's drone. "How did that?" Sam began, but his voice cut off as we turned to look back at the shore. The figures were there, standing in the trees, watching us. One of them raised a hand in a mockery of a wave. We didn't stop paddling until we were miles away. Back home, we reviewed the footage from Sam's camera. Most of it was shaky and blurry, but one clip stood out. It was taken in camp, though none of us remembered filming it. The camera panned across the tents, then turned to the woods, where the figure stood, its black eyes fixed on the lens. Behind it, more shapes emerged from the trees, each one more twisted and grotesque than the last. The video ended abruptly, and for a long time none of us spoke. Megan and I broke up a month later. Sam stopped filming entirely. As for me, I haven't been back to the woods since. I still hear the whispers sometimes, though. Late at night when I'm alone, they call my name. Jack. My name is Abigail Collins. I'm 38 years old, and I've spent the last 10 years chasing stories about nature and folklore, the kind of stories that make people look at their world differently. Most of the time, the mysteries I dig into have rational explanations, a trick of the wind, a misremembered tale. But what happened to me at Devil's Millhopper Geological State Park was different. It wasn't rational. This happened in October 2021. I'd driven to Gainesville, Florida, to explore the park and camp overnight in my RV. Devil's Millhopper had been on my list for a while, thanks to the local legends swirling around its sinkhole. Whispers of cursed settlers, strange disappearances, and echoes that didn't belong. It sounded like the perfect mix of history and mystery for my blog. I arrived late in the afternoon. The park was quiet. Off-season meant fewer tourists, which was fine by me. The air was humid, the kind that clings to your skin and makes everything feel a little heavier. I parked the RV in the lot closest to the sinkhole trail and set out to explore. The sinkhole itself was breathtaking, a massive crater carved into the earth and overgrown with lush greenery. Trails snaked down its sides, with wooden steps descending into the shadows. From the edge, I could hear water trickling far below, and every sound, birds, leaves rustling, even my own breathing, seemed amplified by the acoustics of the crater. I started down the steps, my camera in hand, pausing to take pictures of the layered limestone walls and hanging vines. The farther I went, the cooler the air became, and the light grew dimmer. About halfway down, I stopped. I'd heard something, a voice. Abby. It was faint, almost like the whisper of a breeze, but it was clear enough to make me freeze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely. No response, just the sound of the water below and the occasional rustle of leaves. I shook it off. Acoustics, I told myself. Sound bounces in weird ways here. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. Back at the RV, I started to notice small, annoying problems. The lights flickered when I turned them on. My GPS cut out briefly, and my phone couldn't seem to hold a charge. It wasn't anything I couldn't manage, but combined with the odd vibe of the park, it put me on edge. I made dinner, sat down to write some notes, and tried to distract myself. But as the sun dipped below the trees and the shadows deepened, that feeling of being watched settled over me. Around 9 p.m., I heard the first knock. 3 sharp raps on the side of the RV. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "Hello?" I called out, sliding the curtain back to peer outside. Nothing. The empty parking lot stretched out under the pale glow of a nearby street lamp. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time, the knocks were softer, almost tentative, as if someone or something was testing me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, and the night was unnervingly silent. I circled the RV, shining the beam of light into every corner, but there was no one there. As I climbed back inside, I noticed something on the window. A small handprint smeared in the condensation. A child's handprint. The knocks didn't return, but the night was restless. I dreamed of water, of being pulled under by something I couldn't see. When I woke, the handprint was gone, though I hadn't touched it. Determined to shake off the fear, I headed back to the sinkhole. The morning light made it feel less oppressive, and I reminded myself why I was here. To find a story, not scare myself out of one. I started down the steps again, but this time I wasn't alone. A figure stood near the bottom, staring into the water below. "Good morning," I called out, my voice echoing. The figure turned, revealing a man in his 50s or 60s. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his hat tilted low over his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice gravelly. I frowned. "It's a public park. I'm just exploring." He didn't respond, just turned back toward the water. "Why shouldn't I be here?" I pressed. "The echoes don't lie," he said. Then he walked away, disappearing into the woods at the base of the sinkhole. I spent the rest of the day trying to make sense of his words. Who was he? A park ranger? A local? His warning gnawed at me, especially when the whispers started again. This time, they were louder, more insistent. "Abby," they called, "come closer." I stood at the edge of the water, staring at my reflection. For a moment it looked wrong, distorted, like a face staring back at me from under the surface. I stumbled back, shaking my head. That evening, I went into town to gather more information. The locals were friendly enough, but when I mentioned the sinkhole, they grew quiet. One woman, Martha, leaned in close. "You're not the first to hear things down there," she whispered. "Back in the 1800s, settlers disturbed something they shouldn't have. A burial site, they say. The spirits never left." "Do people still go missing?" I asked. "Not anymore," she said. "People learn to stay away." I didn't. That night, the knocks returned, louder and more insistent. This time, they were accompanied by a faint crying, a child's voice, pleading for help. "Help me," it whimpered. "Please." I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. "Who's there?" The crying stopped. Then, from the direction of the sinkhole, I heard it again. "Abby." I couldn't ignore it. Something compelled me to follow, to find out what was calling me. I grabbed my jacket and headed down the trail, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder as I descended, and the whispers grew louder. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were accusing. "You let him die." I froze. "You didn't save him." The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. My brother, Sam, drowning in the river while I stood frozen on the bank, too afraid to jump in after him. I'd been 15. That guilt had followed me ever since. But how could they know? At the bottom of the sinkhole, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on all sides. I shone my flashlight around, searching for something. Then I saw it. A figure stood across the water, cloaked in shadow. Its shape shifted as I watched, flickering between forms. A man, a child, something inhuman. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its voice was a distorted echo of my own. "You came," it said, its voice like nails scraping on glass. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. It stepped closer, and I realized its feet weren't touching the ground. "You," it said simply. I ran. The trail twisted before me, the trees closing in like grasping hands. The whispers followed, growing louder and more chaotic, overlapping into an unbearable cacophony. When I finally burst into the parking lot, the RV was dark. The engine sputtered as I tried to start it, but the headlights flickered and died. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw the handprint. It wasn't alone this time. Dozens of handprints covered the windows, smeared as if clawing to get inside. I don't know how I made it through the night. I don't know how I managed to drive away when the RV finally started. What I do know is this: something lives in that sinkhole. I don't write about Devil's Millhopper anymore. Some stories are better left untold. But every now and then when I'm alone, I hear it again. The echoes. My name is Jacob Mercer, and I'm 41 years old. For the past 2 years, I've been living out of my RV, roaming from one campsite to another. It started as a way to escape the suffocating routines of my old life. My job as a firefighter, the divorce that followed, and the guilt that came after a child died in a fire I couldn't save him from. I told myself the open road would give me freedom. What I didn't know was how easily freedom can turn into isolation. This happened in November 2022. I had heard about Tate's Hell State Forest on an RV forum. The name caught my attention immediately, and the photos of its dense, hauntingly beautiful landscape sealed the deal. A slice of heaven, one user wrote. If you don't mind the legends, another added. That should have been my first red flag, but I shrugged it off. Legends were just stories, right? I arrived late in the afternoon. The forest was sprawling and eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you second-guess your every move. A ranger station sat near the entrance, but it was empty, a handwritten sign on the door reading, "Closed for the season." Perfect, I thought. No tourists, just me and nature. I found a clearing about half a mile in and parked my RV. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the fading sunlight cast long, twisting shadows across the trees. I set up a small fire pit and unrolled my camping chair, ready to enjoy the solitude. Before I could sit, an old man emerged from the trees. His gray beard was scraggly, his clothes worn and patched. He carried a fishing rod and a bucket of bait, though I hadn't seen any rivers or ponds nearby. "Evenin'," he said, his voice raspy but friendly enough. "Didn't expect company this deep in." I smiled. "Just passing through, needed some quiet." The old man chuckled. "Quiet, huh? You picked the right place. Quiet as the grave." He let the words hang in the air, his smile fading. "Just don't wander too far, son. These woods, they don't always let folks find their way back." "Superstition?" I asked. "Something like that." He adjusted his bucket. "They say this place got cursed a long time ago, a witch. Burned alive by settlers, and she cursed the forest with her last breath. Now it's hers. People hear whispers, see things, and if she don't like you..." He trailed off, letting the silence speak for itself. I thanked him for the warning, though I didn't believe a word of it. He tipped his hat and disappeared into the trees, his footsteps fading like the day's light. That night, my RV lost power. I was in the middle of cooking dinner when the lights flickered and died, leaving me in darkness except for the glow of my lantern. My phone battery, fully charged just an hour ago, was suddenly at 5%. A coincidence, I told myself. Old wiring and a cheap charger. Nothing supernatural. I stepped outside to check the generator and was met with the kind of silence that felt alive. No insects chirping, no wind rustling the branches, just a dense, oppressive stillness. The air was colder than it should have been for November, biting at my skin. As I fiddled with the generator, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, pale and fleeting, at the edge of the clearing. My heart skipped. I spun, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. The next day, I decided to explore the trails. The morning sun burned off the eerie chill, and the forest seemed more inviting. I followed a narrow path that twisted through thick pines and cypress trees, their roots gnarled like ancient fingers clawing at the earth. I wasn't far in when I noticed the symbols. Carved into the trees, crudely drawn but deliberate, circles, triangles, and shapes I couldn't recognize. They repeated every few feet as if marking a path. I took pictures, thinking they might make a good addition to the blog post I was planning. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. Landmarks I swore I'd passed once before seemed to appear again, as though the forest were shifting. At one point, I found myself walking in circles, the same carved tree greeting me no matter which direction I chose. Then I saw her. A woman stood ahead on the trail, barefoot and dressed in a tattered white gown that looked centuries out of place. Her hair was long and matted, her face pale and drawn. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with eyes that seemed too large for her face. "Hello?" I called, keeping my voice steady. She raised a hand, pointing back the way I'd come. "Don't go further," she said. Her voice was soft but carried a weight that made my chest tighten. "Are you lost?" I asked, stepping closer. She shook her head. "Go back. Now." Before I could respond, she turned and vanished into the trees, leaving no trace of her presence. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was setting. The carvings on the trees had spread closer to my campsite, as though someone, or something, had been working while I was gone. I tried to rationalize it, vandals, locals playing tricks, but my nerves were fraying. That night, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the crackle of the campfire, but as the hours passed, they grew louder, more distinct. My name, over and over, carried on the wind. "Jake." I bolted inside the RV, locking the door and closing every curtain. The whispers didn't stop. They pressed against the walls, seeping through the cracks, surrounding me. And then the knocking started. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the back door. I grabbed a flashlight and threw the door open, half expecting to see the old man or the pale woman. But there was no one there, only a fresh carving on the doorframe. A triangle, etched deep into the wood. By the 3rd day, I was unraveling. Sleep had been impossible, and my supplies were running low. The forest seemed to close in tighter with every passing hour, the trees pressing closer to the RV like an encroaching tide. That evening, she came again. The woman in white stood just outside the firelight, her face obscured by shadows. "You stayed," she said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "I don't want trouble," I said, clutching the hatchet I'd kept by my side. "You've brought it," she replied. "What do you want from me?" She stepped closer, the firelight revealing her face, or what was left of it. Her skin was cracked and blistered as if burned, and her eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural light. "This forest is mine," she said, her voice a guttural growl that barely resembled the soft tones from before. "You trespass, you defy, and now you pay." The forest erupted around me. Shadows sprang to life, twisting into monstrous forms with gnarled limbs and hollow eyes. They circled the RV, their whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. I stumbled back, clutching the hatchet, and kicked over the firewood. Flames leapt higher, casting frantic light on the clearing. "Leave me alone," I shouted, slashing wildly at the shadows. The woman in white stood at the edge of the firelight, watching with an expression I couldn't read. Mocking? Pitying? In desperation, I grabbed one of the carved symbols I'd taken from the forest, a small piece of wood etched with a triangle, and hurled it into the fire. The effect was immediate. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into smoke. The woman in white let out an ear-piercing shriek before fading into the night. By dawn, the forest was still again. The carvings were gone, the RV's power restored, as though none of it had ever happened. But as I drove away, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. A single carved triangle on the last tree before the road turned. A warning or a reminder? I don't know. What I do know is this. Tate's Hell isn't just a name, it's a promise. My name is Matt Harper. I'm 32 years old, and I used to be a park ranger before I shifted to city planning. I've always been the type to keep a level head under pressure, but that weekend in Ocala National Forest changed the way I see the world and myself forever. It's hard to explain what we encountered without sounding insane, but I'll do my best. This happened in April 2022. My girlfriend Emma, 2 friends, Tyler and Kelly, and I decided to take an RV trip into the heart of Ocala. Emma, 30, has always been an avid nature enthusiast and the planner of the group. She'd been itching to show us Alexander Springs, where the water is crystal clear and the trails promise adventure. Tyler, 28, my childhood friend, and Kelly, his girlfriend, were tagging along mostly because they loved camping, though Kelly was more into the safety of RV life than the rugged outdoors. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted Kelly's unease from the start. We arrived at our campsite around mid-afternoon on a Friday, excited to leave behind the noise of the city. The RV, which I'd borrowed from my brother, was parked in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air smelled fresh, the kind of scent you can only get deep in the woods. We unpacked quickly, tents for Tyler and Kelly, and Emma and I would use the RV. "See? Perfect," Tyler said, slapping me on the back. "We needed this, man. Get the old crew together." Emma was already wandering the edge of the woods with her camera. "The biodiversity here is incredible," she called back, her voice tinged with excitement. "It's so quiet, though." It was quiet, eerily so. Usually you'd hear birds chirping, insects buzzing, something. Instead, the forest felt like it was holding its breath. I chalked it up to being farther out than usual. That first night was uneventful. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and told the same dumb stories Tyler and I had been recycling since we were teenagers. Kelly, however, seemed uncomfortable. She kept glancing over her shoulder and leaning closer to Tyler. "What's up?" I asked her. "Nothing," she muttered. It's so dark out here." "It's the woods, Kel," Tyler said with a grin. "It's supposed to be dark." We laughed it off and went to bed. I didn't know it then, but the forest had already started watching us. The next morning, Emma convinced us to hike a nearby trail. She was thrilled to explore, and I figured it'd be good to stretch our legs. Kelly was reluctant but joined anyway. We hadn't gone far when Emma froze. She pointed at the ground, a single footprint, barefoot and large. But it wasn't just big. The toes were elongated, tipped with what looked like claw marks. "Bear?" Tyler guessed. "No," Emma said, crouching. "Bears don't leave prints like this." Kelly took a step back. "Let's just go back. This feels wrong." "Relax," Tyler said, brushing it off. "It's probably some weird hiker. People are strange out here." Emma shot me a glance, her brows knitted. I nodded for her to keep walking. The hike became more unsettling. The farther we went, the quieter the woods got. The occasional snapping of twigs sounded deliberate, like something was following us. Kelly kept muttering that she wanted to turn around, and even Tyler's usual cockiness began to falter. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. By the time we got back to camp, everyone was tense. We decided to stick close to the RV for the evening. As I gathered firewood near the edge of the clearing, I heard Emma calling my name. "Matt!" It was distant, coming from deeper in the woods. I frowned. Emma had been by the fire a minute ago. "Matt, come here!" The voice was louder now, insistent. My gut told me something was off, but curiosity won out. I stepped into the tree line. "Emma?" I called. The voice stopped. I turned back toward camp and nearly collided with Emma herself. "Where were you going?" she asked, breathless. "I heard you," I said, shaken. "You were calling me." Her face went pale. I didn't say anything. That night, things got worse. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of movement outside the RV. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching the pine needles. I nudged Emma awake and whispered for her to stay quiet. Peering through the curtain, I spotted a figure near the fire pit. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, and its posture was bent, as though it had been broken and pieced back together. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, heart hammering. "Who's there?" I barked. The figure turned to look at me, and I swear it smiled. Not a friendly smile, but a wide, unnatural grin that made my stomach churn. Before I could react, it darted into the woods with an animalistic speed, leaving no trace. The next morning, we found deep claw marks on the side of the RV and the smoldering remains of our firewood scattered around. Tyler laughed nervously. "Okay, so someone's messing with us." "Someone?" Emma shot back. "You think a person did that?" "It's probably a prank," Tyler insisted. "Locals messing with tourists?" Kelly wasn't convinced. "This isn't normal, Tyler. That thing last night wasn't human." Emma spoke up. "There's a Navajo legend about skinwalkers, shapeshifters that take the form of animals or people to deceive you. They can mimic voices, even faces." "This isn't the Southwest," Tyler scoffed. "That's a desert legend." "Legends travel," Emma snapped. "And whatever it is, it's here." The argument spiraled until I stepped in. "Enough, we're leaving. Pack up and let's go." As we scrambled to break camp, the forest closed in. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of branches far too close for comfort. Kelly stayed by the RV, clutching her arms as if shielding herself from something unseen. Then we heard it. Tyler's voice calling from the woods. "Guys, I found something. Come check it out." We froze. Tyler was right next to me, his face draining of color. "Stay here," I said, grabbing a flashlight and stepping into the trees. Tyler followed despite my protests. The deeper we went, the darker it became. Then we saw it. A figure standing between the pines, its back to us. It looked just like Tyler. "Hey!" I shouted. The figure turned, its face a twisted, grotesque mockery of Tyler's features. Its eyes were too large, its mouth stretched too wide. Before we could react, it let out a guttural, inhuman screech and charged. We bolted back to camp, adrenaline pumping. "We're leaving now," I shouted. Everyone piled into the RV as I started the engine. The tires spun in the loose dirt before catching, and we sped down the forest road. But the thing didn't stop. It ran alongside us, its limbs moving in unnatural jerks, its mouth forming words that weren't quite right. "Matt," it mimicked, its voice distorted. "Don't leave." Emma screamed as it slammed against the side of the RV, claws screeching against the metal. Tyler grabbed a hatchet from the supplies and swung wildly at the window, shattering the glass and forcing the creature to fall back. We didn't stop until we reached a ranger station at the edge of the forest, shaking and covered in scratches from the shattered glass. The ranger took one look at us and frowned. "Alexander Springs?" he asked. We nodded. He sighed. "You're lucky you made it out." We never talked about that trip again. Tyler and I drifted apart after that, and Kelly refused to camp ever again. Emma became obsessed with the legends, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. As for me, I haven't set foot in the woods since. Some places are wild not because of the animals or terrain, but because something else lives there. Something that watches, waits, and hungers. My name is Claire Thompson, and I'm 33 years old. This happened in early March, during what was supposed to be a peaceful RV trip to Devil's Millhopper Geological State Park in Gainesville, Florida. I've been blogging about my outdoor adventures for years, and this trip was meant to capture the park's breathtaking sinkhole, unique geology, and untouched trails. What I found instead was something I still can't explain, something I'll never forget. The drive to Devil's Millhopper was uneventful, just the way I like it. The RV hummed along steadily, and I listened to an audiobook about Florida's hidden gems. I arrived at the park in the late afternoon, the sun casting long golden shadows through the dense forest. Parking the RV near the campground, I stepped outside, inhaling the cool, earthy air. The place was quiet, too quiet. No distant chatter from other hikers, no bird calls, no rustling leaves. I brushed off the unease, chalking it up to my overactive imagination, and set up camp. After a quick dinner of instant noodles, I decided to explore the main attraction, the sinkhole. Devil's Millhopper is breathtaking. The sinkhole is massive, like an ancient wound in the Earth's surface, surrounded by lush vegetation and steep wooden stairs leading down to the bottom. I was struck by how the air felt heavier here, cooler and damp, like stepping into another world. As I circled the rim, my boot scuffed something buried in the dirt. Curious, I crouched down and brushed away the soil. It was a small carved stone, weathered and cracked, with faint etchings that looked like symbols or runes. I took a photo with my camera, thinking it might be an artifact worth mentioning in my blog. The light was fading fast, so I decided to head back to the RV. That night, as I sat in the RV editing photos, the first odd thing happened. The photo of the carved stone, one of dozens I'd taken that day, appeared strange. The stone in the image glowed faintly, though I hadn't noticed anything unusual when I took it. My laptop flickered, then shut off completely. The power in the RV had been fine all day, but now the lights dimmed and my phone refused to charge. Then came the sound. Faint, mournful singing, like a lullaby drifting through the trees. I froze, the hair on my arms standing on end. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the wind through the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to ask one of the park rangers about the sinkhole and the carved stone. The ranger, an older man named Bill, was initially friendly but grew tense when I mentioned the stone. "You found what?" he asked, his voice tight. I described the artifact, showing him the photo on my camera. His face darkened. "You shouldn't have touched that." "Why not?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Is it part of the park's history?" Bill hesitated. "There's a story. Locals call it a curse. They say the sinkhole was sacred ground for the indigenous people who lived here long ago. There was a woman, a shaman or healer, who threw herself into the sinkhole after her village was massacred. Folks say her spirit still lingers, protecting the land." I laughed nervously. "A ghost story, huh? That'll make for a great blog post." Bill didn't smile. "It's not just a story. Leave the stone where you found it. And be careful." That afternoon, I hiked the trail again, determined to get more photos for my blog. The carved stone was still where I'd found it, half buried in the dirt. I felt a strange pull toward it, as if it were calling to me. I snapped another photo and moved on. That's when things got weird. The trail, which I'd walked just the day before, seemed unfamiliar. No matter how far I went, I kept circling back to the same spot, the edge of the sinkhole. My GPS glitched, showing my position as a spiraling loop. Frustrated, I decided to retrace my steps, but the woods had grown darker, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me. The air grew colder, and I began to feel lightheaded. I don't know how long I wandered before I finally stumbled back to the RV, my legs trembling. When I checked my watch, 3 hours had passed, though it felt like minutes. That night, I dreamed of the sinkhole. In the dream, I was standing at the bottom, surrounded by murky water. A woman emerged from the shadows, her face pale, her eyes black voids. She didn't speak, but I felt her rage, her sorrow, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The RV was ice cold, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth. Then I heard it again, the singing, closer this time. My flashlight flickered as I stepped outside. The forest was eerily still, the shadows between the trees darker than they should have been. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the woods, her figure translucent and shimmering. Her long hair clung to her wet, emaciated frame, and her hollow eyes locked onto mine. My body froze, my breath hitching in my throat. She raised a hand and pointed toward the sinkhole. The next morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed up the RV and tried to leave, but the engine wouldn't start. It groaned and sputtered, refusing to turn over. Panic clawed at me as I realized I was trapped. Desperate, I returned to the sinkhole, the carved stone in my hand. The air was thick with tension, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "I'm sorry," I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls of the sinkhole. "I didn't mean to disturb you." The ground beneath me trembled, and the figure appeared again, rising from the shadows. She pointed at the stone, her hollow eyes burning with intensity. I dropped it, letting it roll into the depths of the sinkhole. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the air grew lighter, and the oppressive weight lifted. The figure faded, leaving me alone at the edge of the sinkhole. Back at the RV, the engine roared to life on the first try. I didn't look back as I drove away, the forest retreating in my rearview mirror. But even now, months later, I can't forget the way she looked at me, like she was warning me, or maybe pleading for help. And sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I still hear that mournful singing. My name is Jack Morris, and I'm 42 years old. This happened in late October during a weekend camping trip to Falling Waters State Park in Florida. I was there with my wife, Linda, our 10-year-old daughter, Sarah, and our 7-year-old son, Joey. What started as an ordinary family trip turned into something I'll never forget, though sometimes I wish I could. We had planned the trip as a way to disconnect from screens and reconnect as a family. I wanted to teach my kids a bit about survival skills, maybe show them how to start a fire or identify edible plants. Linda was on board, even though she had her reservations about the old RV I insisted on driving. It had its quirks, flickering lights and an engine that sometimes took a few tries to start, but I was confident it would get us through. When we arrived at Falling Waters State Park, the sun was just beginning to set. The golden light filtered through the tall pine trees, and the sound of distant birdsong filled the air. The kids were already squabbling over who got which bunk bed in the RV, and Linda sighed as she unpacked a cooler full of sandwiches and snacks. "This is going to be good for us," I said, giving her a reassuring smile. "Fresh air, family bonding, it's what we need." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on the dense woods surrounding our campsite. "Sure, as long as nothing breaks down." That evening, we gathered around a small fire I built. Joey poked at the flames with a stick, and Sarah was off to the side, scribbling in a notebook she brought along for stories. She had a vivid imagination, always making up tales about fairies and witches. Linda read a book, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the firelight. "What are you writing about, kiddo?" I asked Sarah. She looked up and smiled. "A friend I met today." My heart sank for a moment, thinking she might have wandered off and spoken to a stranger. "What friend?" "Ellie," she said matter-of-factly. "She lives by the waterfall." I exchanged a glance with Linda. "You didn't go off alone, did you?" Sarah shook her head. "No, I didn't meet her in person. She just started talking to me when we got here." Linda frowned. "Honey, it's okay to have an imaginary friend, but don't scare your dad like that." Sarah's expression darkened. "She's not imaginary." I didn't push it. Kids have wild imaginations, and I figured it was just part of her storytelling hobby. The first truly strange thing happened later that night. I was outside, stoking the fire one last time before bed, when I heard it. Faint laughter coming from the woods. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I stood still, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. "Kids?" I called, but they were already inside the RV with Linda. The laughter faded, and I told myself it was probably another camper. Still, it put me on edge. The next morning, Linda complained about a cold draft in the RV. "It's like someone left the door open," she said, pulling her cardigan tighter. I checked the door and the windows. Everything was locked up tight. We spent the day hiking to the park's main attraction, the waterfall. Sarah was unusually quiet, lagging behind and glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. Joey, on the other hand, was full of energy, running ahead and shouting, "Come on, slowpokes." The trail led us to the waterfall, a beautiful cascade of water tumbling into a deep sinkhole. As we admired the view, Sarah tugged on my sleeve. "Ellie says this is where it happened," she whispered. "Where what happened?" I asked, my voice low. Sarah didn't answer. She just stared at the water. That night, the strangeness grew worse. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of faint knocking on the RV door. My first thought was that it was Joey playing a prank, but when I checked, both kids were asleep in their bunks. The knocking came again, this time from the back of the RV. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold night air. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone around, except for a single pair of child-sized muddy prints leading toward the woods. The next morning, Sarah seemed withdrawn, and Joey complained about bad dreams. Linda pulled me aside. "Something's not right here, Jack," she said. "The kids aren't acting like themselves." I didn't want to admit it, but I felt it too, a heaviness in the air, a sense that we weren't alone. By the third day, things reached a breaking point. Sarah began talking to Ellie out loud, carrying on conversations as if the girl were standing right beside her. When Linda tried to intervene, Sarah shouted, "You're scaring her. She doesn't like it when you yell." That night, I woke to the sound of the RV door creaking open. Sarah was gone. Panic surged through me as I grabbed a flashlight and followed her tiny footprints into the woods. I found her standing by the waterfall, her arms outstretched as if reaching for something. A faint figure stood in front of her, a young girl soaking wet, her hair hanging in tangled strands over her pale face. "Sarah!" I shouted. The figure turned toward me and I froze. Her eyes were hollow, black pits, and her mouth twisted into a scream that echoed through the woods. Linda arrived moments later, clutching Joey's hand. Together, we pulled Sarah away from the water. The ghost didn't follow, but her presence lingered, oppressive and cold. Back in the RV, we tried to make sense of what was happening. Sarah, still dazed, murmured, "She's so lonely. She just wants someone to stay with her." I remembered the muddy footprints, the laughter, the feeling of being watched. "She's dangerous," I said. "We need to leave, now." But the RV wouldn't start. The lights flickered and the air grew colder. A loud bang came from the roof, followed by the sound of scraping metal. Linda clutched my arm. "What does she want?" "She wants Sarah," I said, my voice trembling. Linda suggested offering Ellie something to appease her. Sarah hesitated, then handed over a doll she'd brought along. "Ellie can have this," she said, "so she won't be lonely anymore." We left the doll at the base of the waterfall, whispering a prayer for Ellie to find peace. For a moment the woods fell silent, and I thought it was over. As we drove away, the RV finally roaring to life, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second I thought I saw Ellie standing at the edge of the woods, clutching the doll. Then she was gone. The kids were quieter on the ride home, and Linda seemed lost in thought. We didn't talk about what happened, not right away, but every now and then I catch Sarah staring out the window as if listening to someone I can't hear. And sometimes, when the house is quiet at night, I hear faint laughter, just beyond the edge of the light. My name is Claire Thompson, and I'm 34 years old. I work as a freelance photographer, traveling around the country in my RV to capture landscapes and abandoned places. This story happened about a month ago when I was camping in Big Shoals State Park, Florida, near the Suwannee River. What I experienced there changed the way I see the world, and the things that might linger in the spaces we think are empty. The drive to Big Shoals was peaceful, the kind of slow winding road I've come to love. My RV, a dependable second-hand model, hummed along as I navigated through towering oaks and pines. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth. I had planned to spend 3 days exploring the park, capturing the rushing rapids of the Suwannee River and the limestone cliffs that lined its banks. When I arrived, the visitor center was empty except for a ranger named David. He looked up from his desk as I walked in, his face weathered but kind. "Afternoon," he said. "You here for the trails or camping?" "Both," I replied. "I'm a photographer. Thought I'd get some shots of the river." David frowned slightly. "Just be careful around the water. It's beautiful but unpredictable. And don't camp too close to it." "Why not?" I asked, curious. He shrugged. "Currents can be dangerous, and people say strange things happen out there. I've heard about voices, kids playing near the river, stuff like that." I chuckled. "Ghost stories?" "Call it what you want," he said, his tone serious. "But don't ignore the signs. Stay safe." I thanked him and left, dismissing his warnings as part of the park's folklore. Still, his words lingered as I drove to the campsite. I set up my RV near a clearing, a short walk from the Suwannee River. The late afternoon sun glinted off the water, and the sound of the rushing rapids was hypnotic. I spent the first few hours walking along the trails, snapping shots of the limestone bluffs and the towering cypress trees. The place was stunning. Things took a turn that evening when my drone malfunctioned. I had been flying it over the river to capture aerial shots when it suddenly veered off course and crashed into the trees. Muttering curses, I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the woods to retrieve it. The forest was darker than I'd expected, the dense canopy swallowing the light. I found the drone near the riverbank, but as I bent to pick it up, I noticed something strange. Small handprints in the mud, like those of children. They were fresh, too, leading toward the water. I scanned the area with my flashlight. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The only sound was the rushing water. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I shook it off. Kids must have been playing here earlier, I told myself. Still, I hurried back to my RV, uneasy. That night, as I reviewed the photos on my laptop, I noticed something odd. In one of the shots of the river, there were faint figures in the background, small, pale shapes that resembled children. I zoomed in, but the resolution wasn't clear enough to make out details. It's just a trick of the light, I thought, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of laughter. It was faint, distant, but unmistakably that of children. Groggy, I peered out the RV's window but saw nothing except the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the river. The laughter came again, closer this time. My chest tightened as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. "Hello? Who's out there?" The laughter stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood frozen, my flashlight beam scanning the tree line. Finally, I retreated to the RV, locking the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I decided to shake off the weirdness and focus on my work. I hiked along the trails, capturing the beauty of the park. But the unease grew. The forest seemed quieter than it should be. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps. As I neared the river, I saw him, a boy standing on the opposite bank. He looked about 8 years old, with pale skin and clothes that seemed out of place, like something from the 19th century. He didn't move, just stared at me. "Hey!" I called out. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy raised his hand and pointed downstream. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to follow him, but something about the way he moved, silent and smooth, like he wasn't quite real, kept me rooted to the spot. That night, the sounds returned. Laughter, splashing, and faint voices echoed through the forest. At one point, I heard a girl's voice calling my name. "Claire," she whispered, "come play with us." My blood turned cold. I checked the windows, but the outside was dark. Then I heard footsteps, tiny, pattering steps circling the RV. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by a low rushing sound, like wind through the trees. But the air was still. Then I saw them, 3 children, standing near the edge of the clearing, their eyes hollow and their skin pale and translucent. They didn't speak, just stared, their heads tilted slightly as if curious. One of them, a girl with long tangled hair, took a step toward me. Panicking, I slammed the door shut and locked it. The children vanished, but the sound of their laughter echoed in my ears long after they were gone. By the next day, I was ready to leave, but when I turned the key in the RV's ignition, nothing happened. The battery was dead. Frustrated, I grabbed my camera and decided to take one last walk to the river before finding help. When I reached the bank, the children were waiting for me. This time, they were closer, their forms more solid. The boy from before stepped forward. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. I'm taking photos," I stammered. "I didn't mean to disturb anything." "You're in our place," the girl said, her hollow eyes boring into mine. "Stay with us." I shook my head. "I can't." The children exchanged looks, then reached out their hands. The air around me grew colder, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "You can't leave," the boy said. "No one leaves." Desperate, I pulled out my camera. "Look," I said, showing them a photo of the river with their faint silhouettes. "You're here. People will know your story. You won't be forgotten." The children hesitated. The cold air eased slightly, and their forms flickered as if caught between this world and the next. "Promise?" the girl whispered. "I promise," I said, my voice trembling. The children faded, their laughter echoing softly as they disappeared. The forest grew quiet again, but the air felt lighter, less oppressive. When I returned to the RV, the engine started on the first try. I didn't question it, I just drove. Back at the visitor center, I told David what had happened. He listened, his face grave, but didn't say much. As I left, he muttered, "You're lucky they let you go." I wrote an article about the lost children of Big Shoals, sharing their story alongside my photos of the hauntingly beautiful river. None of the ghostly silhouettes appeared in the published images, but I didn't care. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I wouldn't go back. My name is Kayla Waters, and I'm 28 years old. What I'm about to share happened just 2 months ago during a camping trip in Tate's Hell State Forest in Florida. I used to laugh at ghost stories and legends. Now, I'm not so sure. It was my idea to go. I'd read about the forest's creepy history, stories of people vanishing, strange curses, and the infamous final words of Tate. My name is Tate, and I've been to hell. It seemed perfect for an adventurous weekend with my closest friends. There were 4 of us. Danny, my best friend since high school, level-headed and sarcastic at 30. Melissa, quiet and jumpy but sweet, tagged along reluctantly. And Cody, a guy I'd known for years but never fully trusted. He was brash, competitive, and had a habit of stirring up trouble. I suspected he had a crush on me, which only made things awkward. We took my RV, an old but functional beast, and parked it deep in the forest. The swampy smell of the air and the dense canopy of twisted trees added to the eerie vibe. Perfect, I thought. We set up near a clearing surrounded by cypress trees. Danny got the fire going and Melissa unpacked supplies while Cody cracked jokes about the forest's name. "Tate's Hell?" he said with a smirk. "Probably just an old drunk who got lost." "Yeah, and died," Danny shot back. "So, maybe keep your jokes down, Cody. Don't want to piss off the ghosts." Melissa shivered and muttered, "Can we not talk about ghosts?" I laughed, trying to ease the tension. "Relax, guys. It's just a forest. What's the worst that could happen?" That night, the first sign of something wrong came when the generator started acting up. We'd just finished eating when the RV's lights flickered, then went out. The only light came from the fire, casting long, dancing shadows across the trees. "I'll check it," Danny said, grabbing a flashlight. He came back a few minutes later, looking puzzled. "Everything's fine with the generator. It just stopped. I don't get it." Cody snorted. "Probably a squirrel chewed a wire. No big deal." But I noticed Melissa staring into the trees, clutching her jacket. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" I asked. It sounded like whispering, like someone saying my name. We all went quiet. I didn't hear anything, but the air felt heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. The next day, we decided to hike a nearby trail. I brought an old map I'd found online, but it quickly became clear it was outdated. Trails branched off in confusing directions, and landmarks didn't match up. We wandered for hours before stumbling across something unsettling. It was a small clearing with a crude shrine made of sticks and bones. Animal skulls hung from the trees, and strange symbols were carved into the dirt. Melissa refused to go near it. "Probably just a hunter's prank," Cody said, poking at the bones with a stick. "Don't touch it," Melissa snapped, surprising everyone. "It's not a prank. This feels wrong." I told Cody to leave it alone, and we moved on. But the tension was thick, and even Danny looked uneasy. Back at camp, the generator failed again. The map I'd left on the picnic table was gone, as if the wind had taken it. But the air was still. That night, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it clearly. Someone saying my name, faint but unmistakable. "Danny," I hissed, shaking his arm. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" he said groggily. Before I could answer, we heard it again. A high-pitched scream, far away but chilling. Melissa started crying. "It's just an animal," Cody said, though his voice shook. But it wasn't just an animal, I was sure of it. The next morning, Melissa refused to leave the RV. She said she'd seen something in the woods the night before. A pale woman with hollow eyes, watching us from the shadows. "You were dreaming," Cody said dismissively. "You've been spooked since we got here." "No," Melissa said firmly. "I wasn't dreaming. She was real." I wanted to believe Cody was right, but the way Melissa said it sent a shiver down my spine. Still, we decided to stay. I didn't want to give up on the trip because of some creepy noises. That evening, Melissa vanished. We were sitting by the fire when she suddenly stood up and walked toward the swamp. "I'll be back," she said, her voice flat. "Melissa?" I called after her. She didn't turn around. Danny and I followed her flashlight beam, but it stopped abruptly near the edge of the swamp. The mud was churned up and her shoe lay half buried. There was no sign of her. Panic set in. We shouted her name, but the only response was the croaking of frogs and the rustle of leaves. Then Danny found the altar. It was larger than the one we'd seen before, surrounded by bones and rotting wood. Symbols were etched into the mud, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The air reeked of decay. "This is wrong," Danny said. "We have to leave. Now." As we made our way back to the RV, the forest came alive. Shadows darted between the trees, and the whispers turned into voices, mocking, taunting, calling our names. Then we saw her. The witch. She was pale, gaunt, with stringy black hair and hollow eyes that burned with hatred. She stood motionless, watching us, her bony hands outstretched. Cody froze, staring at her in terror. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. Before anyone could answer, the witch let out an ear-piercing scream. The ground beneath us seemed to ripple, and spectral hands reached from the swamp, clawing at our legs. We ran for the RV, but the witch followed. Her twisted form appeared in every shadow, her whispers filling our ears. When we reached the clearing, we found the RV surrounded by grotesque humanoid figures with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. They clawed at the windows, hissing and growling. Danny grabbed a can of lighter fluid and a lighter. "The altar," he said. "We have to destroy it." We ran back to the altar, dodging the figures that seemed to materialize from the swamp. Danny doused the wooden effigies with fluid and lit them on fire. The flames roared to life, and the witch screamed in rage, her form flickering like a dying candle. But as the altar burned, Cody was dragged into the swamp. He screamed for help, but the spectral hands pulled him under. Then he was gone. The witch vanished, and the forest fell silent. Danny and I stumbled back to the RV, shaking and covered in mud. The generator worked again, and the lights flickered back on. When we reached the ranger station the next day, we reported everything. They didn't believe us but promised to search for Melissa and Cody. A week later, Melissa's body was found near the altar. Cody was never recovered. I still hear the witch's voice in my dreams, whispering, "This forest is mine. You will never escape me." And I don't think I ever will. My name is Gabrielle Hunter. I'm 56 years old, a retired high school teacher, and a widower. What I'm about to tell you happened just last month, during a solo camping trip off Old King Road in Flagler County, Florida. I thought I was looking for peace and quiet, maybe even a little closure. Instead, I found something I still can't explain, something that might still be out there, waiting. I arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The drive down Old King Road was scenic but desolate, with tall oaks draped in Spanish moss and palmettos crowding the edges of the narrow dirt road. My RV, a beaten-up 1994 Winnebago, rattled over every bump, but I was used to it. This wasn't my first trip, but something about the stillness unsettled me. I stopped at a convenience store a few miles before the campsite to grab some firewood and snacks. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, looked up from her magazine as I approached. "Camping out on King Road?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Yeah," I said. "I heard it's quiet out there. Good stargazing." She hesitated. "It's quiet, all right, just don't wander too far from your RV, and if you hear anything strange, don't go looking for it." I laughed it off, but her words stayed with me as I drove the final stretch to the campsite. The sun was low and I parked near a pond, the water dark and still. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. I liked the solitude, at least that's what I told myself. The first sign that something wasn't right came that night. I had a small fire going, and the RV's generator was humming softly. I was sitting by the fire nursing a cup of instant coffee when the generator sputtered and died. The sudden silence was jarring. "Damn thing," I muttered, grabbing a flashlight to check it out. Everything looked fine, no loose wires, no obvious problems. When I flipped the switch, it roared back to life as if nothing had happened. I returned to my chair, but the unease lingered. The forest around me felt too quiet, like the wildlife had been holding its breath. Then I heard it. A faint rustling in the bushes behind me. I turned, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Probably a raccoon, I thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. The pond looked serene in the daylight, its surface reflecting the gray sky. As I circled it, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud. They were large, clawed, and definitely not human. A chill ran down my spine. That's when I saw him, a teenage boy, maybe 15 or 16, standing at the edge of the trees. He was thin, with dirty clothes and wild, unkempt hair. His eyes darted nervously as if he didn't want to be seen. "Hey there," I called out. "Are you lost?" The boy flinched, but he didn't run. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. "Do you live out here?" He shook his head. "It's watching you. It watches everyone. You have to leave before it gets dark." Before I could ask more, he turned and bolted into the woods. I considered going after him, but something in his voice, pure, raw fear, stopped me. I returned to the RV, uneasy. That evening, I found a mutilated deer near the edge of the pond. Its body was torn apart, the flesh twisted and shredded as if by massive claws. I've seen animal attacks before, but this was different. It looked deliberate. I decided to stay inside the RV that night. The generator kept cutting out, leaving me in darkness for minutes at a time. Each time the lights flickered back on, I thought I saw movement outside the windows, shadows darting just out of sight. Around midnight, I heard a sound that froze me in place, my late wife's voice. "Gabe," Dana whispered, "come outside." I knew it wasn't real. I'd been dreaming of Dana ever since she passed, but this was different. Her voice was so clear, so close. When it called again, I almost opened the door before catching myself. "No," I whispered, backing away. "You're not real." The whispers stopped, but the RV shuddered violently, as if something heavy had slammed into it. I grabbed a kitchen knife and held it tight, heart racing. The shuddering stopped, leaving me in silence. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the RV's door like claw marks. The boy, Ethan, appeared again, standing at a distance. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "It's hungry," he said. "It doesn't stop." "What is it?" I demanded. approaching him. "What's out there?" He hesitated, then muttered, "It's old. It was here before us. It feeds on fear, on grief. If you don't leave, it'll take you." I tried to get him to explain, but he ran off again. This time, I followed him. He led me deeper into the woods where the trees grew denser and the air colder. Finally, we reached a clearing with strange symbols carved into the trunks. Ethan pointed at them. "This keeps it out," he said. "Stay here if you want to live." Before I could ask more, he vanished into the trees. I looked around, my pulse hammering. The forest felt alive, the air thick with an oppressive energy. The whispers started again, louder this time, coming from all directions. I returned to the RV, but the hunger followed. That night, it showed itself. I was sitting by the fire when the forest went silent. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure at the edge of the trees. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed yellow, fixed on me. "Dana," it said. Its voice distorted and hollow. "Come to me." I stood frozen as it stepped closer. The firelight flickered and I saw its face, or what was left of it. The flesh was stretched and rotting, its mouth too wide, filled with jagged teeth. I grabbed a can of lighter fluid and doused the fire pit, igniting a massive flame. The creature recoiled, letting out an unearthly shriek. I ran toward the symbols Ethan had shown me, the hunger chasing me through the trees. The moment I crossed the boundary of the symbols, the hunger stopped. It paced back and forth, hissing and snarling, but unable to cross. I stayed there until dawn, clutching the knife and listening to its guttural growls. When the sun rose, the hunger vanished. I returned to the RV, packed up, and drove away without looking back. I stopped at Maggie's store on the way out. She took one look at me and nodded. "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded, too shaken to speak. "You're lucky," she said. "Most people don't make it out." Later, I tried to find information about Ethan, but no one had seen a boy matching his description in years. Some said he was a ghost, a victim of the hunger long ago. Others claimed he was something else entirely, a guardian of sorts protecting the living from the forest's darkness. Whatever the truth, I know one thing for certain. The hunger is real, and it's still out there waiting. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 41 years old, and this happened a few months ago when I decided to take a break from the life I'd been barely holding together. My wife, Jenna, passed away last year, and the silence of my empty home had become unbearable. I'd always loved music. It's what I taught for years. But after she died, I couldn't bring myself to pick up a guitar. So I bought an RV and decided to travel, hoping to find something, anything, that would help me feel alive again. That's how I ended up at Big Shoals State Park in Florida. I'd read about the park's rapids, the largest in the state, and thought their roaring, chaotic beauty might inspire me to compose again. What I didn't know was that the silence I'd been running from would find me there, in the voices of the dead. I pulled into the park just before dusk. The forest was dense and quiet, save for the distant roar of the rapids. The ranger station was empty, but I found a map pinned to the bulletin board outside. It marked a few trails and campsites, one of which was near the riverbank. That's where I decided to stay. As I set up my RV, a ranger approached, a woman in her 30s, wearing the usual khaki uniform and a wide-brimmed hat. Her name tag read Laura. "You're camping alone?" she asked, her tone polite but laced with concern. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just needed some peace and quiet." Laura nodded but hesitated. "The rapids can be unpredictable. Be careful if you hike near the water. And," she paused, glancing toward the tree line, "some people say you can hear voices out there at night." Probably just the water playing tricks, but it can be unsettling if you're not used to it. I smiled, more amused than unnerved. Thanks for the warning. Laura didn't return the smile. Just don't wander too far. With that, she left, her words hanging in the cool evening air. After dinner, I sat outside the RV with my guitar, strumming idly as the last light faded from the sky. The sound of the rapids was louder now, a constant rush that drowned out the usual nighttime symphony of crickets and frogs. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of inspiration. Maybe this trip wasn't such a bad idea. Then I heard it, a faint giggle like a child's carried on the wind. I froze, my fingers stilling on the strings. It was faint, almost drowned out by the river, but unmistakable. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No answer, just the river and the faint rustle of leaves. I told myself it was nothing, just an echo or my imagination playing tricks, and went inside to sleep. But that night, I dreamed of Jenna. She was standing by the river, her back to me, humming the lullaby she used to sing when we were younger. I tried to call out to her, but no sound came from my lips. When I woke, my cheeks were wet with tears. The next morning, I decided to hike one of the trails that wound along the river. The air was crisp, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden streaks, but the unease from the night before lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway down the trail, I noticed something odd. Small footprints in the mud, too small to belong to an adult. They ran alongside my own for a few steps before veering off toward the river. There were no other campers around, and the sight sent a chill down my spine. As I followed the trail, the roar of the rapids grew louder, almost deafening. Then I heard it again. A child's laughter, clear and sharp, cutting through the noise. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called. Again, no answer. Shaking my head, I pressed on, determined to reach the riverbank. When I got there, I found something even stranger. A small, moss-covered doll lying on the rocks. Its face was faded and weathered, but its eyes seemed to glint in the sunlight, almost as if they were watching me. I picked it up, examining it closely. As I turned it over, a faint melody began to play. A music box tune, soft and haunting. My breath caught in my throat. The tune was the same lullaby Jenna used to hum. That evening, I couldn't shake the melody from my head. It felt like the forest was closing in, the shadows growing longer, the air heavier. As I sat in the RV, the music box tune began to play again. Faint at first, then louder. I searched the RV, convinced I'd accidentally brought the doll inside, but it wasn't there. The tune stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft knock at the door. I froze. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle and yanked the door open. No one was there. Just the empty forest, bathed in moonlight. Then I saw them. Shadows flitting between the trees. They were small, childlike, moving too quickly to be human. My stomach churned as I realized they were circling the RV. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The RV began to shake as if something, or many somethings, were pounding on the sides. I shouted for them to stop, but the noise only grew louder, the whispers and laughter blending into a chaotic cacophony. Finally, I grabbed my guitar and strummed the first chords that came to mind, playing louder and louder until the shaking stopped. The laughter faded, leaving only the sound of my music and the distant roar of the rapids. The next morning, I knew I had to leave, but something drew me back to the river. I followed the trail again, clutching the doll I'd found. The voices were louder now, calling my name, singing the lullaby in eerie, childlike tones. When I reached the riverbank, the air grew icy, and the shadows beneath the trees seemed to ripple like water. "I know you're here," I said, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The voices grew louder, and the shadows took shape. 3 children, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark voids. They stared at me, their expressions a mix of sadness and anger. "Help us," they whispered, their voices overlapping in a haunting harmony. "What do you need?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. They pointed to the doll, and in that moment, I understood. They were tied to it, bound to the river by whatever tragedy had claimed them. I placed the doll on the ground and stepped back, watching as the children reached for it. But as their hands touched it, their forms began to twist and contort, their whispers turning to wails. The river surged, the rapids crashing violently, and the shadows rushed toward me. I stumbled backward, tripping over the rocks, and ran as fast as I could, the screams echoing in my ears. I left Big Shoals that day, vowing never to return. The doll stayed by the river, but the memory of those voices has haunted me ever since. I tried to write about it, to turn it into a piece of music, but every time I play, I hear their whispers in the background. A week after I got home, I found the doll on my porch. Its music box was broken, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear it playing. My name is Marisol Reyes. I'm 34 years old, and this happened just a few months ago, though it feels like a lifetime. I'd been working as a travel nurse for years, moving from city to city, living in the chaos of hospitals and crowded apartments. When I finally took some time off, I decided to embrace solitude. Just me, my RV, and the open road. That's how I ended up in Tate's Hell State Forest in Florida, a place whose name alone should have been a warning. I'd read about the forest's ominous reputation online. Supposedly, it was named after a man, Tate, who wandered the swamp for days under a curse, only to emerge near death and mutter, "My name is Tate, and I've been through hell." Most people dismissed it as folklore, but something about the story intrigued me. It felt like a challenge, a test of my independence and survival skills. I planned to camp there for 3 days, hiking and documenting the experience for my travel blog. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The forest was dense, with towering pines and sprawling oaks draped in Spanish moss. The air was thick and humid, buzzing with the constant hum of insects. As I parked my RV at a remote campsite, a park ranger named Mitchell appeared, his orange vest bright against the darkening trees. "You sure you want to stay out here alone?" he asked, his tone friendly but cautious. "Why not?" I replied, trying to sound confident. He shrugged. "It's quiet, that's for sure. But stick to the marked trails. People get lost out here. And some say the swamp doesn't like strangers." I laughed nervously, brushing off his warning. He tipped his hat and left, leaving me alone with the encroaching shadows. As I set up my small campfire, I noticed an older woman standing near the forest entrance. She was watching me intently, her gray hair pulled back in a tight braid. I waved, but she didn't return the gesture. Instead, she called out, her voice carrying an odd weight. "The swamp doesn't forgive the curious," she said, her tone more ominous than I'd have liked. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I told myself she was just a local trying to spook me, but her words lingered as the night deepened. That night, the forest was eerily silent. I'd expected the usual symphony of crickets and frogs, but instead, there was a suffocating stillness. As I sat by the fire, I heard faint whispers, too quiet to make out but unmistakably human. I froze, straining my ears. The whispers grew louder, circling the RV, though I couldn't see anything beyond the firelight. Finally, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the crackle of the fire. My heart raced as I climbed into the RV, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of a long drive and an overactive mind. But when I woke the next morning, muddy handprints covered the windows. Large, smeared prints that didn't look entirely human. The next day, I decided to hike deeper into the forest, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The trails were muddy from an overnight storm, and the dense canopy made it hard to tell what time of day it was. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the forest felt. The air grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, as though the trees themselves were alive. About an hour in, I found strange wooden symbols hanging from the branches. They looked hand-carved, crude but deliberate. Circles, crosses, and spirals strung up with twine. I snapped a few photos for my blog, but a shiver ran down my spine. It felt wrong, like I was trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. As I turned to head back, I heard laughter, high-pitched and echoing unnaturally. My stomach clenched. I called out, hoping it was other campers, but no one answered. The laughter faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves, as if something was following me. I quickened my pace, refusing to look back. That night, the unease turned to outright terror. As I sat in the RV, trying to write about the day's hike, the lights began to flicker. Then the entire vehicle shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. I grabbed a flashlight and flung the door open, but there was nothing there, only the dark, silent forest. As I stepped outside, the air grew colder. I swung the flashlight in every direction, the beam slicing through the darkness. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure stood just beyond the edge of the firelight, tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. Its limbs were too long, its body unnaturally thin, and its head tilted as if studying me. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching. Then, it began to drift toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it. The figure didn't follow, but I could feel its presence, lingering just outside. By morning, I was desperate to leave. I packed up quickly, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, and the dashboard lights flickered uselessly. Frustrated, I grabbed my map and decided to hike to the ranger station for help. The forest seemed even more menacing in the daylight. The wooden symbols I'd seen the day before were now broken, their pieces scattered across the trail. As I pushed deeper into the swamp, the air grew thicker, choking me with the stench of decay. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding me on all sides. Eventually, I stumbled upon a clearing where a crude grave marker stood, a wooden cross, weathered and rotting, with a rusted knife embedded in the ground beside it. The whispers grew deafening, swirling around me in an unintelligible chorus. That's when I saw it again. The figure emerged from the shadows, more solid this time. Its face was pale and skeletal, its eyes burning with malevolent light. It raised one spindly arm, pointing directly at me. "I'm sorry," I gasped, though I didn't know what I was apologizing for. The figure tilted its head as if considering my words before letting out a low guttural growl that shook the ground beneath me. Panicked, I grabbed the knife from the grave and held it out like a talisman. The figure recoiled slightly, but it didn't retreat. In a desperate bid to escape, I dropped the knife and lit a small fire with the matches I kept in my pack. I hurled burning branches toward the figure, and for the first time it retreated, its form dissolving into the shadows. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I ran. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was beginning to rise. The engine miraculously started on the first try, and I tore out of the forest, not stopping until I reached a crowded rest area miles away. I haven't been back to Tate's hell, and I don't plan to. I didn't write about the experience in my blog. Some things are too personal or too terrifying to share. But even now, I can't escape the feeling that I didn't leave the forest entirely behind. Last week, I found muddy handprints on my apartment window. I live on the 3rd floor. My name is Tyler Grant. I'm 28 years old, and this happened just 6 months ago. I was on assignment for a magazine, writing about myths and legends tied to Florida's wilderness. I've always thought of myself as grounded and practical, a skeptic, really. But my trip to Myakka River State Park changed that forever. It was Eric's idea to begin with. He was my oldest friend, a year younger than me, 27, and completely obsessed with the paranormal. While I loved nature and photography, Eric loved ghost stories, cryptids, and chasing legends. When I told him I was writing about Florida's Bigfoot, the skunk ape, he lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. You have to go to Myakka," Eric said, grinning through the phone. "It's prime territory. There are sightings all the time." I wasn't sold, but he was persistent. He even offered to come along, promising he'd help with interviews and filming. Reluctantly, I agreed. We pulled into the park late on a humid Friday afternoon. The RV groaned as we found a spot near the edge of the campground. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks, and the air smelled like damp earth and decaying leaves. Eric was giddy, practically bouncing as we unpacked our gear. "This is perfect," he said, snapping photos with his phone. "I can feel it. Something's out here." "You're insane," I replied, rolling my eyes. "This is just another swamp." That night, we cooked over a small fire and swapped stories with a couple from the neighboring campsite. They shared some local folklore, but nothing particularly scary. Eric brought up the skunk ape, and they laughed. "People say they see it, but it's just gators or bears," the husband said, "or tourists who drank too much." By the time we settled into the RV, the temperature had dropped slightly, and the forest had gone quiet. Too quiet. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear the faint hum of crickets outside, punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves. The next morning, we set out on a trail that wound deep into the swamp. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting long, shifting shadows on the muddy ground. Eric was armed with his camera and a notebook full of local legends. I focused on my own camera, snapping shots of the eerie, moss-covered trees and the still, glassy water. About an hour in, we found the deer carcass. It was fresh, too fresh. The poor animal's ribs jutted out like broken ivory, and its hindquarters looked half-eaten. But there were no tracks, no signs of a predator. Just the carcass lying in the middle of the trail, and those strange, jagged claw marks running across its flank. "Tyler," Eric whispered, kneeling to examine it, "this isn't right." "It's probably a gator," I said, though I wasn't convinced. Gators didn't leave claw marks like that. Eric pulled out his camera, snapping pictures. "I bet it's a skunk ape. They hunt deer, right?" I groaned and walked ahead, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. As the day went on, things got stranger. My camera batteries, fully charged that morning, drained within hours. Eric's flashlight, which he hadn't even used, began flickering erratically. The air felt heavier, pressing down on my chest, and every so often I caught the faintest whiff of something rancid, like rotting meat. By the time we reached the campsite that evening, I was exhausted and irritable. Eric, however, was thrilled. He claimed he'd seen something. A tall, shadowy figure slipping between the trees. I dismissed it as his overactive imagination, but when he showed me the blurry photo on his camera, I couldn't deny it looked wrong. The figure was humanoid but distorted, with elongated limbs and a head that seemed too large for its body. "You're messing with me," I said, though my voice wavered. Eric just smirked. "You saw the deer, man. Something's out here." That night, I woke to a strange sound, soft, deliberate tapping. At first I thought it was rain, but as I blinked into the darkness, I realized it was coming from the RV window. "Eric?" I hissed, nudging him awake. "Did you hear that?" He groaned and sat up, rubbing his eyes. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then something scratched the side of the RV, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across metal. "Probably raccoons," Eric muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. We stayed up the rest of the night, the small fire outside casting flickering shadows across the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, just beyond the firelight. The next morning, Eric wanted to explore deeper into the swamp. I was hesitant, but he convinced me to give it one more shot. As we hiked, the forest grew denser, the air thick with humidity. That's when we heard it, a voice calling my name. "Tyler!" It sounded like Eric, but he was standing right beside me. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my heart pounding. Eric nodded, his face pale. "It's not me, man, I swear." We quickened our pace, but the voice followed us, echoing through the trees. Then it changed. It wasn't just calling my name anymore. It was laughing. The sound was high-pitched and unnatural, like a mocking cackle. By the time we made it back to the RV, the sun was setting. Eric was panicked, muttering about wendigos, creatures from Native American legend that mimicked voices to lure their prey. I tried to stay calm, but the dread in my chest was impossible to ignore. We built a large bonfire and sat close to it, hoping the light would keep whatever it was at bay. As the fire crackled, I saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. It was tall, impossibly thin, with glowing eyes and a skull-like face. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Stay back!" Eric shouted, tossing a burning stick toward it. The creature didn't flinch. It just circled us, its glowing eyes never leaving our faces. Eric snapped. He grabbed a flashlight and charged toward the creature, yelling at me to stay put. "Eric, don't!" I shouted, but he was already gone, disappearing into the darkness. For what felt like hours, I sat alone by the fire, clutching the largest stick I could find. The creature didn't follow Eric. It stayed close, watching me, its head tilting as if studying my fear. Eventually, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, and the creature melted back into the shadows. I called for Eric, but there was no answer. When the park rangers arrived, they found nothing. No sign of Eric, no tracks, nothing to explain the scratches on the RV or the whispers in the swamp. They chalked it up to an accident, a tragic case of someone getting lost in the wilderness. But I knew better. I left Mayaka that day, but the memories followed me. I still hear Eric's voice sometimes, faint and far away, calling my name in the dead of night. I never went back to finish the article. Some truths are better left untold. My name is Nate Carter, and I'm 38 years old. This happened in late February, deep in the swamps of Big Cypress National Preserve in Florida. I'd driven my RV into the wilderness, looking for isolation and a chance to test my survival skills. I didn't go there for the peace or the beauty. I went to prove that I could live off the land, just me against nature. What I found instead wasn't nature. It was something darker, something I still can't fully explain. I arrived at Big Cypress early in the morning, the mist still clinging to the trees. My RV rattled over the rough dirt road, bouncing with every pothole. I finally found a clearing near the edge of the swamp, shaded by towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. It was perfect, remote, quiet, and miles away from the nearest person. I parked, unloaded my gear, and set up camp. My plan was simple: spend 2 weeks out here, relying on my skills and instincts. I had basic supplies, some canned food, a water filter, and a few tools, but I wanted to rely mostly on what I could catch or forage. I wasn't worried, I'd done this before. By late afternoon, the swamp came alive. Birds called from the trees, frogs croaked in the distance, and the faint hum of insects filled the air. It felt like stepping into another world. But as I finished setting up camp, I noticed something odd. Large hoof prints in the soft mud near my RV. They were too big to be from a deer and too deep to belong to a boar. I stared at them for a while, then shrugged it off. Big Cypress was home to all sorts of animals, and I figured it was nothing to worry about. That night, the swamp was eerily quiet. I sat by my campfire, jotting notes in my journal about the day. I was about to turn in when I heard it. A deep, resonant sound, like the rumble of a distant drum. It came from somewhere in the swamp, low and rhythmic. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound faded as quickly as it had started. I told myself it was just the wind or the creak of trees shifting in the breeze. I didn't want to admit it, but it left me uneasy. When I crawled into bed, I locked the RV door. I don't usually do that. There's nothing out here that I can't handle. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next few days were more unsettling. On the second morning, I noticed that some of my supplies were missing. A few cans of food, a small hatchet, and my fishing line. I knew I hadn't misplaced them, and there was no sign of anyone else nearby. But the hoof prints were back, this time circling the RV. They were deeper now, like something heavy had been pacing around my camp. The swamp itself seemed different too. The birds that had been so noisy on the first day were silent, and the air felt heavier, more oppressive. I kept brushing off the feeling of being watched, but it was getting harder to ignore. On the fourth night, I heard the sound again, the drumming, louder this time and closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the trees. I scanned the swamp but saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. A flash of something tall and dark disappearing into the trees. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steadier than I felt. No answer, just the faint rustle of leaves. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before retreating to the RV and locking the door again. The next day, I went deeper into the swamp, determined to find answers. I followed the hoof prints, which led me to a clearing I hadn't seen before. In the center stood a crumbling stone altar, half buried in the muck. It was adorned with animal bones, skulls, ribs, antlers, all arranged in a way that felt deliberate. The carvings on the altar were faded but intricate, depicting swirling shapes that seemed to shift if I stared too long. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wasn't superstitious, but something about this place felt wrong. I backed away, intending to leave, when I noticed fresh hoof prints leading away from the altar. They were impossibly large, almost like they'd been made by some kind of monstrous animal. That night, the black stag appeared. It was just beyond the edge of the firelight, its glowing red eyes piercing the darkness. Its massive antlers seemed to stretch into the night sky, and its dark, sinewy body glistened as if wet. It didn't move, just stared, its presence heavy and suffocating. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. Eventually, it turned and melted into the shadows without a sound. That night, I dreamed of the black stag. In the dream, it stood at the edge of my campfire, speaking in a voice that was both deep and resonant, like the rumble of thunder. "You've wandered too far," it said, its voice echoing in my head. "This is my domain. You can leave, or you can stay and be consumed." I woke drenched in sweat. The fire burned out and the RV colder than it had any right to be. When I stepped outside, I found hoofprints circling the camp again, closer this time, almost touching the edge of the fire pit. I decided I had to leave. I packed up what little I could, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I checked the battery. It was completely drained, though it had been fully charged the day before. That night, the black stag returned. This time, it stepped into the light of the fire. It was even more terrifying up close, its fur matted and black, its eyes glowing like embers. It towered over me, and when it spoke, its voice echoed through the swamp. "You cannot leave without offering something in return." "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Your freedom," it said. I didn't know what that meant, but I wasn't about to give it anything. Instead, I grabbed my lighter and ran to the altar. I doused it in fuel and set it ablaze, the flames roaring to life and consuming the bones and carvings. The black stag let out an unearthly roar, its form twisting and writhing before it dissolved into the shadows. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in days, the swamp felt alive again. The next morning, the RV started on the first try. I drove out of Big Cypress as fast as the dirt road would let me, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I haven't told anyone about what happened, not fully. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear the drumming sound, faint and distant. And when I close my eyes, I see those glowing red eyes watching me from the darkness.